lost in a flooded Turkish gorge, freezing, starving, and with no cell signal. David Mackey and his friends were trapped. One by one, their bodies began to shut down. Then things got worse. In this part of the world, bad things that happen aren't supposed to reach the media. There's censorship by the Turkish government. But once in a while, a story like this actually makes it out. Personal video from David captured the intense moments from his nightmare. Viewer discretion is advised. The Lycian Way stretches along Turkey's southern coast. Jagged hills, ancient ruins, and cliffs that drop into the Mediterranean. It looks like paradise, but it's actually the opposite. This place is secluded and many people have died here. David and his friends were persuaded by a local who dared them, lulled into thinking that the local was just testing them. This area of Turkey has no cell or GPS coverage, just wilderness that doesn't care if you make it out. Some die slowly, others don't even see it coming. On January 11th, 2015, 3 foreign students stepped into the wilderness thinking they knew what they were doing. David Mackey, 21, was from Nottinghamshire, England, studying abroad in Istanbul. His friends, Friso de Vries and Marie-J de Groot, were Dutch. They were all completely unaware of what they were walking into. They had no business being out there. It was supposed to be simple, a quick trip to Antalya, Turkey, just something kind of casual. So they packed light, just rain jackets, some snacks, a flashlight, and one phone between the 3 of them, nothing else. They didn't know that winter hikers avoid this trail for many reasons, that once you're on it, you're basically alone. It was David who said something first. Hours into their hike, he looked around and realized that they hadn't seen a single other hiker, not since they left town. That should have been a warning sign, a sign for them to turn back. Instead, they just kept going. The trail was clear at first, gravel paths and pine forest, but the weather quickly turned. The wind picked up, clouds dropped fast over the hills, and then came the rain. They followed what looked like a trail, but it wasn't. They thought it was a smart way to go because they wanted to take a shortcut and things just felt strange to them on this trail. They couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but they knew something was just off. No people and no sun. This was an area where they entered a wide, dry riverbed. It looked easier to walk, so they followed it. That decision, that single step off the trail, was the beginning of something they couldn't undo. Still, they kept going. But the terrain narrowed. The sides of the riverbed turned into steep cliffs. There was no easy way to climb out now, and then, without warning, water started flooding in. One moment you're walking on dry ground or semi-wet ground, and the next, well, it's waist deep in fast-moving water. The 3 friends were cut off. They tried to turn back, but it was too late. The way behind them was already underwater. They were still hours from sunset, but the sky had gone gray, the air was cold, everything they had was soaking wet, and they were trapped in a flooded ravine in the middle of the Turkish wilderness. They hadn't told anyone their exact route. Their phones had no signal here, and the town was somewhere below them, and ironically, they could actually hear traffic and the faint call of prayer echoing up from the valley. But the gorge that they were in had walls that were too steep, too wet, and too high for them to get out of. What had started like a quick weekend hike had already turned into something else. They were stranded and completely alone. The 3 couldn't stop shivering, so they had to find somewhere to get some sort of warmth. They eventually found a cave in the rock. It was shallow and just large enough for all 3 of them to lie side by side. It was dry and shielded from the wind. That alone made things a bit better, and that's where they decided they were going to sleep for the night. Inside, they took stock of what they had. A phone with a dead battery, a flashlight, a few scraps of food left, mostly crumbs. No fire, no way to make fire, no warm layers, and no tools. Friso was the first to get sick, a dry, shallow cough that turned into chills. He said he was fine, but they didn't believe him. They could see the color leaving his face. Something was really wrong with him. They were asking him before the trip if they should even go because they knew that he was getting sick. Mary J was quiet. She stared at the rocks, at the water below, and stopped responding unless spoken to directly. At this point, they'd eaten all their food, and there was nothing left, not even a crumb. They spent the entire next day in the cave. and then night came. The rain let up on the third day, the sky cleared, and the sun came out. But the water didn't go down. They waited. They kept talking, mostly about what they would eat when they got out, or what they would have done differently before this hike. They thought about their families, how they must have worried. They joked about calling this their survival story, but no one was really laughing. Every hour, David would climb out of the cave and walk a few feet down to the gorge to see if the water had dropped. It didn't. They tried moving down the ravine once, but a narrow bend in the valley forced the water into a deep, fast-moving channel. David waded in to test the depth and felt himself nearly slip away. He fell hard, gashing his knee, and pulled himself out, shaking and breathless. After that, they decided to stay put. It was just too dangerous to try to do anything. They had to pray for rescue. On the fourth day, David declared that he was too cold, and he started trying to make a fire. He gathered bark and dead twigs and tried striking stones together, but everything was just too damp, nothing was working. He tried again and again until his fingers were raw. The cold was deep in their bones by then. They had been freezing every night, and then when the day came, there wasn't much warmth. The night was always the worst part, something that they dreaded. They slept pressed up against each other, fully clothed, covered in leaves and dirt. Their bodies curled to conserve whatever heat they still had.
This is where we have been sleeping for the last 4 days.
By the fifth day, they were eating insects. Ants, mostly. They figured it out by an accident. David watched a line of them crawling up the cave wall and decided to try one. He was so hungry. He never felt anything like this before in his life. He said it was sweet. They left the flashlight on at night and it attracted flies. They caught them in cupped hands and ate them too. It wasn't enough to give them energy, but it was something to get their stomachs from cramping with hunger pains, something that they were having a real hard time dealing with. They drank runoff water from the rock walls, cold, clean, but brutal in their core temperatures. They knew that, but there was no other choice. The river was muddy and fast. Somewhere in the background of all of this, behind the cold, the wet, and the hunger, was the simple fact that they might not make it out. They started thinking about this being their final resting place. But no one said it, not out loud. David kept talking about what they would do when they got back to Istanbul. Frizo said his brother was supposed to visit next month. Mary J asked David to tell her something funny, but he couldn't think of anything. He was just too miserable and desperate. At this point, it had been 5 days. The rain had returned overnight, and they were beginning to lose all hope. And David knew they were never going to get out of here unless he did something. And that's when he got an idea. By the 6th day, the cave didn't feel like shelter anymore. It felt like a tomb. The rocks were damp. They hadn't been warm since the first night, and hadn't eaten anything substantial in days. Their bodies were slowing down. They could barely even talk to each other, and they stopped trying to figure out a way. It felt like time was just stretching, that the minutes inside the cave moved differently. The light would change, and they'd look up and realize an entire day had passed. Frizo had stopped moving. His chest cold was getting worse. His joints hurt. David tried to get him to drink some water, but he wouldn't. The cold water just sent a shock through their systems every time they swallowed it. And Frizo couldn't do it anymore. It was just too cold, and their bodies were already freezing. There was no way to warm the water, and David's efforts to start the fire did nothing. There was also no direct sunlight into the cave. On the 7th morning, David heard a rock slide down the gorge. Just a few stones tumbling, maybe triggered by rain, but it sent his heart racing. For a second, he thought someone was coming. He stood up, too fast, and then blacked out. When he came to, Mary J was shaking him gently, asking if he was okay. He hit his head really hard on the rock. He wasn't sure what was going on, but said he was fine, even though he wasn't. Later that day, he noticed the condensation on the cave walls. He just started licking it, just for something to do, something other than just waiting. The others were silent. They thought David was going crazy. Friezo's cough at this point was extremely bad and aggressive. David started to have small hallucinations. He thought people were crawling into the cave and then running away from them. He asked Mary J if she heard a car engine once. She hadn't. She just looked at him and couldn't say anything. At this point, Friezo asked what day it was. He wasn't sure if they were alive or dead. David thought for a while. Then he realized he had no clue. They had no way of marking time. They knew that they had gone in on a Sunday, but it was past that now. Maybe Thursday, maybe Friday. Each day blended into the next, and the cave didn't care what day it was. That night, while David was hallucinating, he started to think about cold batteries. He remembered reading in a story about survival that once the battery performance drops in low temperatures, a dead battery might not actually be truly dead if warmed back up. He didn't have a charger, no power bank, but he did have his hands. The phone had been off since the second day, completely dead. He took it out of his soaked bag and just held it between his palms, and then pressed it against his chest. He rubbed it slowly, just to try to bring it up to temperature. It seemed pointless, but it gave him something to do. He held the phone for nearly an hour, then pressed the power button. Nothing. He shook his head at the phone. Mary J asked him what he was doing and told him to stop. Later, after lying awake for what felt like an entire night, he reached for it again. He held it tighter this time, digging it deep into his armpit, anything to get it warm. He clicked the button again. A screen lit up. 1%, then 2%, then 3%. He didn't know if he was hallucinating again or not. He called the emergency number. A signal bar flashed for a second. Just one. And then a call connected. A Turkish dispatcher answered. David kept his voice calm. He explained the situation, gave them what little location data he could because he didn't know the name of the trailhead. He really had no idea how to formulate thoughts in his head, and he knew that he wasn't making any sense. He didn't know the coordinates. He just said they were stuck in a ravine and they needed help desperately. And that was the last thing he said before the call dropped. The battery died, gone for good. He wasn't sure if that was a hallucination or if that actually happened. They were still convinced that help would never come and that was just not real. But for the first time in nearly a week, they had done something, real or not, that could potentially change their outcome. And now, all they could do was wait. When the phone died, David didn't tell the others right away. They thought he was insane anyway. When Friezo and Mary J were sleeping, or pretending to be, they were on opposite sides of the cave. David started hallucinating about the call again. He wasn't sure if it was real because he never received a confirmation message back. No real sign that any of that had ever happened. Nothing came. Not that day, not that night. This was a moment where they had some clarity, but then they went back to their delusional state. The next morning, David thought he heard something. At first, it was a soft thump, muffled by the valley walls. Then a slow, rising hum, like a motor climbing through the air. He scrambled to look outside the cave. It was a helicopter. He wasn't sure if it was real, but it was something. It wasn't flying directly overhead, but more off to the side, following the curve of the ridge. But it was the first real sign that someone was looking for them. He picked up a branch and waved it around in the air like a signal flare. The others emerged from the cave and joined him, screaming into the sky, pointing towards the clearing. The helicopter didn't stop. They kept flying, past the ravine, over the next ridge, and disappeared into the trees. Friezo sank back down. Mary J covered her face. David stood frozen, his arms still raised, the branch still in his hand, staring at the spot where the helicopter had vanished. It had been so close. It meant the call had worked. But it also meant rescue wasn't coming yet. They took turns, climbing partway up the ridge and stopping where it became too steep or too wet to continue. It was the first time they had acted with purpose since the second day. The second night after the helicopter was the worst since the beginning. Not because of the cold, not because of the hunger, but because they knew someone was so close. Help was real, and still, they were all alone. No one slept that night. They all took turns standing at the cave mouth, flashlight in hand, scanning the tree line for movement. Anything. But the ravine stayed quiet. The rain had stopped. The wind had picked up again. The water had dropped slightly, but it was still moving too fast for them to cross safely. At the dawn of the 8th day, Mary J. heard voices. At first, she thought it was another hallucination. She hadn't eaten for nearly a week, and her thoughts made no sense. But Frizo heard it too. Somewhere below them, foreign voices were yelling at them in Turkish. The three of them scrambled to the edge of the gorge and screamed back. The group of search and rescue volunteers was moving through the lower forest. They'd fanned out in teams across the valley, using thermal drones and rough coordinates traced from David's emergency call. The helicopters passed overhead multiple times that day before the cloud cover had obscured their exact location. Now, on foot, they were closing in. 10 minutes later, another team came from above. Trained in high-angle rescue, had descended into the ravine from the ridgeline with ropes and packs. When they reached the cave, one of them dropped to his knees and hugged all three of them in turn. David tried to say something but couldn't. His mouth was too dry, and he had no idea what was going on. Frizo cried, not loudly, just quietly, without blinking. Mary J. didn't speak until she was strapped into a stretcher. They were carried out one by one, then airlifted to a hospital in Antalya, Turkey. They had severe dehydration, to the point where they had just hours left to live, extreme fatigue, and a severe caloric deficit. They looked nothing like themselves from when they started the trail. Their eyes were sunken, their speech was slow, but they were alive. David's parents had already flown in. They had come to identify a body, not greet a survivor. When they saw him in the hospital room, pale, thinner, but standing, they broke down. A Turkish official called the rescue a miracle. Others called it luck, but for the three students, it had come down to one thing: a tiny spark of warmth coaxed back into a dead phone, and a message that reached the right person at the right time. For 8 days, they had been ghosts in the woods, unheard, unseen, lost. But now, they were going home. Back in England, David sat in his kitchen drinking hot tea. It had been less than a week since his rescue. When asked if he would hike again, David said yes, but next time, he'd pack for a week. And that's all I have for this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel. More stories are coming soon, and I hope to catch you at the next one.